Hi, boys and girls. This is Mrs. Riccio. I'm here to continue with our chapter book, Flora and Ulysses, and I'm going to start off on page 122, chapter 38, Unremitting Darkness. You, said Dr. Machine to Florida, will have a seat on the sofa and listen to the Mozart, and I will go and make us some sandwiches. What about my father, said Flora. Shouldn't I tell him where I am? Mr. George Buckman knows where you are, said Dr. Machine. He knows that you are safe. So good. All is good. You will sit on the horse-chair sofa, please. Dr. Machine went into the kitchen, and Flora turned and looked at the couch. It was a huge couch. She dutifully sat down on it, and then slowly, very slowly, slid off it. Wow, she said. She climbed back up on the couch and concentrated on staying put. She sat with her hands on either side of her and her legs straight out in front of her. She felt like an oversized doll. She also felt very, very tired and a tiny bit confused. Maybe I'm in shock, she thought. Terrible things can happen to you. Had done an issue listing the symptoms of shock, but Flora couldn't remember what they were. Was one of the symptoms of shock that you couldn't remember the symptoms of shock? She looked over at Ulysses. He was still sitting on the dining room table. He looked confused too. She waved at him, and he nodded back. And then she noticed that there was a picture hanging on the wall opposite the couch. It was a painting of what looked like nothing but darkness. Unremitting darkness. Unremitting darkness was a phrase that occurred often in the criminal element. But why would someone paint a picture of unremitting darkness? Flora slid off the couch and walked over to the painting and stared at it more closely. In the middle of all the darkness there was a tiny boat. It was floating on a black sea. Flora put her face right up against the painting. Something was wrapped around the painting. Some tentacled shadow. For the love of Pete, the tiny boat on the dark sea was getting eaten by a giant squid. Flora's heart protested with a small thud of fear. Holy Bagumba, she whispered. From the kitchen, there came the sound of clinking silverware and crashing plates. The opera music ended. Ulysses, said Flora. She looked behind her and saw the squirrel sitting on the floor, sniffing his tail. Come here, she said to him. He walked over to her, and she picked him up and put him on her shoulder. Look, she said. He stared at the painting. This boat is getting eaten by a gigantic squid. He nodded. It's a tragedy, said Flora. There are people on board on that boat. Look, you can see them. They're ant-sized, but they're people. Ulysses squinted. He nodded again. They're all going to die, explained Flora. Every last one of them. As a superhero, you should be outraged. You should want to save them. Incandesto would. Ah, said Dr. Machine, coming up behind them. You are studying my poor, lonely giant squid. Lonely, said Flora. The giant squid is the loneliest of all God's creatures. He can sometimes go for the whole of his life without seeing another of his kind. For some reason, Dr. Machine's words conjured up the face of William Spiver, white-haired and dark-eyed. Flora's heart squinched up. Go away, William Spiver, she thought. That squid is a villain, said Flora out loud. He needs to be vanquished. He's eating a boat. And he's going to eat all the people in the boat. Yes, well, loneliness makes us do terrible things, said Dr. Machine. And that is why the picture is there, to remind me of this. Also, because the other Dr. Machine painted it when he was young and joyful. See the painting? It looks pretty dark. Good grief, thought Flora. What did he paint when he was old and depressed? Now you will sit on the horse chair sofa, please, said Dr. Machine, And I will bring out the jelly sandwiches. Flora sat down on the couch. Ulysses was still on her shoulder. She put up her hand and touched him. He was warm. He was a small engine of warmness. The giant squid is the loneliest creature in all existence, said Flora out loud. And then, to keep things grounded and in perspective, she muttered, "Seal blubber." And then she whispered, "Do not hope. Instead, observe." She kept her hand on the squirrel. Chapter 39, The Tears Roll Off. Dr. Machine came out of the kitchen holding a pink plate with small sandwiches on it. She sat down next to Flora. "You are enjoying the horse chair sofa," she said to Flora. "I guess," said Flora. She wasn't sure exactly how someone enjoyed a horse chair sofa. "You will eat a jelly sandwich," said Dr. Machine. She extended the plate to Flora. Ulysses leaped off Flora's shoulder and onto her lap. He sniffed the plate. "Our patient is hungry," said Dr. Machine. "He never had breakfast," said Flora. She took 2 sandwiches and handed one to Ulysses. "This sofa," said Dr. Machine, "is the sofa of my grandmother. She was born on this sofa, in Blunder, Messine. She lived the whole of her life there, and she is buried there in a dark wood. But that's a different story. What I meant to say is that when I was a girl in Blunder, Messine, I sat on this sofa and spoke with my grandmother about inconsequential things well into the gloom of evening. That is what a girl in Blunder, Messine did in those days. She was expected to speak of inconsequential things as the gloom of the evening descended. Also, she must knit. Always the gloom was descending in Blunder, Messine. Always, always, one was knitting outfits for the little trolls." "What little trolls?" said Flora. "And where's Blunder, Messine?" "Never mind about the trolls for now. I meant only to say that life was very gloomy then, and one was always knitting." "It sounds lousy," said Flora. "It was exactly this. Lousy," said Dr. Machine. She smiled. Her dentures were very bright. There was a smear of grape jelly in one of her fake incisors. Flora reached for another sandwich. "Had terrible things can happen to you. Ever warned against eating jelly sandwiches in the house of a woman from Blunder, Messine?" "Your father is a lonely man," said Dr. Machine. "Also, very sad to leave you. This broke his heart." "It did?" said Flora. Yes, said Yes. Mr. George Buckman has sat on his horse chair sofa many times. He has talked of his sadness. He has wept. The sofa has seen the tears of many people. It is a sofa that is good for tears. They roll off it, you see. Her father has sat on the couch and wept as the gloom of the evening descended. Her father has sat on this couch, and he had wept as the gloom of the evening descended. Flora suddenly felt like she might cry too. What was wrong with her? Seal blubber, she thought. The words steadied her. She handed another sandwich to Ulysses. "Your father is very capacious of heart," said Dr. Machine. "Do you know what this means?" Flora shook her head. "It means the heart of George Buckman is large. It is capable of containing much joy and much sorrow." "Oh," said Flora. For some reason, she heard William Spiver's voice saying that the universe was a random place. "Capacious heart," said Dr. Machine's voice. "Random universe," said William Spiver's. "Capacious, random, heart, universe." Flora felt dizzy. "I'm a cynic," she announced, for no particular reason, in a too loud voice. "Bah, cynics," said Dr. Machine. "Cynics are people who are afraid to believe." She waved her hand in front of her face as if she were brushing away a fly. "Do you believe in things?" said Flora. Yes, I believe," said Dr. Machine. She smiled her too bright smile again. "You have heard of Pasquale's Wagger?" "No," said Flora. Pascal, said Dr. Machine, had it that since it could not be proven whether God existed, one might as well believe that he did, because it was everything to gain by believing and nothing to lose. This is how it is for me. What do I lose if I choose to believe? Nothing. Take the squirrel, for instance, Ulysses. Do I believe he can type poetry? Sure. I do believe it. There is much more beauty in the world if I believe such a thing is possible. Flora and Dr. Machine looked at Ulysses. He was holding half a sandwich in his front paws. There were blobs of grape jelly in his whiskers. Do you know what a superhero is? Said Flora. Sure, I know what a superhero is. Ulysses is a superhero, said Flora, but he hasn't really done anything heroic yet. Mostly, he's just flown around. He lifted a vacuum cleaner over his head. He wrote some poetry. He hasn't saved anyone, though. And that's what superheroes are supposed to do, save people. Who knows what he will do, said Dr. Machine. Who knows whom he will save? So many miracles have not yet happened. Flora watched as one of the jelly blobs on Ulysses' whiskers trembled and fell in slow motion to the horsechair sofa. All things are possible, said Dr. Machine. When I was a girl in Blunder Machine, the miraculous happened every day, or every other day, or every third day. Actually, sometimes it did not happen at all, even on the third day, but still, we expected it. You see what I'm saying? Even when it didn't happen, we were expecting it. We knew the miraculous would come. There was a knock at the door. See, said Dr. Machine, this will be your father, George Buckman. Flora stood and went to the door and opened it. It was her father, and he was smiling, again, still, which did seem kind of miraculous. Hi, Pop, she said. You see, said Dr. Machine, he smiles. Flora's father's smile got bigger. He took off his hat. He bowed. George Buckman, he said, how do you do? Flora couldn't help it. She smiled too. She was still smiling when a noise that sounded like the end of the world echoed through the hallway of the Blixen Arms. 1 minute her father was standing there with his hat in his hands, smiling, and the next minute, Mr. Claus, the cat one, came out of nowhere and landed right on top of George Buckman's unprotected head. Oh my, I wonder what happened. Remember, good readers always ask them questions while they're reading. Chapter 40, Vanquished. Fortunately, a superhero was present. Sunny side up. I'm sure you're guessing who this reader is, who this superhero is. And here he is. I don't know if you can see. The cat was on his head, but Ulysses got on top of the cat, and he pulled the cat's ear, and he pushed the cat off of his head. For the love of Pete, holy Bagamba, vanquished! And the superhero was enormously, inordinately pleased with himself. He felt immensely powerful. He felt like writing a poem. Ulysses is a superhero. He saved Flora's dad from the cat. Chapter 41, I promise. They were in the car. Flora's father's hands were on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock and 2. Flora was sitting up front and Ulysses' head was out the window. They were heading back to Flora's mother's house, in spite of Flora's protestations. We have to go back, said her father. We have to return at the regular Saturday afternoon time. We have to act normal, natural, unconcerned. Flora wanted to object, but she could read the writing on the wall, or rather, she could read the words that hovered above her and her father and the squirrel. Destiny could no longer be forestalled. The arch nemesis must be faced. Holy Bagamba, said her father. His right ear was wrapped in a huge amount of gauze. His head looked lopsided. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. A squirrel vanquished a cat. He shook his head. He smiled. "And now it's time for another battle," said Flora. "Everything will be fine," said her father. "So you say," said Flora. It started to rain. Ulysses pulled his head back inside the car. He looked up at Flora, and the sight of his little whiskered face calmed her somehow. She smiled at him, and the squirrel sighed happily and curled up in her lap. "When I was a girl in Blunder Machine," Dr. Machine had said to Flora when they were all leaving apartment 267, "we wondered always if we would see each other again. Each day was uncertain. So to say goodbye to someone was uncertain, too. Would you see them again? Who could say? Blunder Machine was a place of dark secrets, unmarked graves, terrible curses. Trolls were everywhere. So we say goodbye to each other the best way we could. We said, I promise to always turn back to you. I say those words to you now, Flora Belle. I promise to always turn back toward you, and now you must say them to me." "I promise to always turn back toward you," Flora had said. She whispered the words again now to the squirrel. "I promise to always turn back toward you." She put a finger on Ulysses' chest. His tiny heart was beating out a message that felt like, "I promise, I promise, I promise." Hearts were the strangest things. "Pop," said Flora. "Yes," said her father. "Can I feel your heart?" "My heart?" said her father. "Okay, sure." And then, for the first time ever, George Buckman took both his hands off the steering wheel while the car was in motion. He opened his arms wide. Flora gently moved Ulysses out of her lap and onto the seat beside her, and then she reached up and across and put her hand on the left side of her father's chest, and she felt it. Her father's heart beating there inside of him. It felt very certain, very strong, and very large, just like Dr. Machine had said, capacious. "Thank you," she told him. "Sure," he said. "You bet." He put his hands back on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock, and the three of them, Flora, her father, and the squirrel, traveled the rest of the way home in a strange and peaceful silence. The only noise was from the windshield wipers. They hummed back and forth and back and forth, swinging a sweet, out-of-tune song. The squirrel slept, and Flora Belle Buckman was happy.